Here's another anonymous question. This is a super, super basic question. Very welcome here. What do you see as the main pros and cons of buying versus renting while in grad school? Or some factors we should be thinking through in making that decision?
Gosh, I just don't support anybody renting for multi-year periods. You're okay. Let me take a step back. You have more control as a homeowner. You only have to live in your primary residence for 8 out of the 12 months. If you're in a rental agreement, you're required to stay there for the full year. There's limitations on pets, noise, all these things. When you own a home, if you don't like where you're living the next year, or you want to make some changes, you always can rent it out. You can sell it. You could stop making the mortgage payments and let it get foreclosed upon. But I just wanted to emphasize that I think there's a lot more flexibility in home ownership than there is someone who's going to be renting maybe for a 2-year period. And the disaster stories just don't really exist that much. I don't really meet a lot of people who give me feedback like, oh, I bought a house and immediately the roof collapsed, or there was a massive plumbing issue, or things weren't up to code and we had to make renovations. I don't hear that a lot. And from my experience, not only having PhDs, but all types of people who are trying to buy, not very often do people end up in a bad situation in a few years down the road. There's zero return on renting, and you're actually fixing in your housing payment, minus the taxes could fluctuate, but you're fixing in your payment when you own. When you rent, your rent could go up $100-200 every year, because maybe the landlord understands you're only here for a few year period and they know you're going to stay. You probably won't move if it's only $100 difference, but you can flip the script on that and be the homeowner who has an extra room that they rent out, and you can mitigate your housing costs during grad school and invest that difference in your index funds or other types of investments. I personally Airbnb a room. I have an empty room upstairs and I Airbnb the other one. There are unexpected expenses after you purchase, but being the owner and the landlord, if you're renting out any space, like, you're the one in control. Wouldn't you rather be setting the price for rent instead of negotiating the price of rent down? And that's how I look at it. I mean, 5 years at $1,500, when you add it up, ends up being a lot of money.
I really love this question because Sam and I have different opinions about this. So we can have a little bit of like a debate. And I actually agree with a lot of what Sam just said, but personally, like, I waited until I was like 36 before buying my first home. So I obviously for a long time saw the merits of renting, and I still do see the merits of renting in many situations. I do want to say, Sam just said, I don't know many people who like buy a lemon essentially, but I actually interviewed one of those people on my podcast. So you might want to listen to that episode. I just put it in the chat, of this person who really regretted purchasing a home. And, some of this could have been like, a lot of his story is like, hey, don't make the same mistake I did. Like, do your due diligence when you purchase a property, like, those kinds of things. So it's a horror story that you can learn from. So check that out. But I would say that the main pros and cons of renting versus buying is the amount of risk you're taking in your finances. So like Sam was just talking about, the downsides of renting are pretty well known, right? Like, how much money you're going to be paying in rent. And yes, it's likely going to increase by a certain degree every single year. And yes, that is out of your control, but you have limited risk in the sense that anything that goes wrong with that property is not your responsibility. However, on the opposite side, the downside of owning is much, much steeper. The potential downside of owning is much, much steeper than the potential downside of renting. The upside of owning is also much, much higher than the upside of renting. So like, it's just how much of this how much of this risk and like volatility are you willing to accept? So if you own, the house is your responsibility. You got to do those repairs. You got to, edit, et cetera, et cetera. And the market can also drop. So you may not experience like, okay, so overall, like over the long term, the housing market appreciates around or a little, maybe a few percentage points ahead of where inflation is. So usually over the long term, people make a little bit of money on their home, not as much as you would make through investing. And that's averages. That can be different from area to area. You can get lucky, you can get unlucky. So if you happen to get unlucky, like if you happen to buy at the top and then 5 years later when you're ready, when you're done with grad school and you're ready to sell that home, if the price has gone down or it hasn't gone up enough, you could, if you go through with selling at that point, you could need to bring money to the table. It could not be a great thing financially for you. However, I want to emphasize, like Sam said earlier, there are ways to mitigate these different risks that you might be taking on by buying. I'm still very bullish on buying. It's just you have to kind of go into it with your eyes open. So like, for example, you don't have to sell your house when you finish graduate school. You can become a long distance landlord. You can have a property management company manage it for you if it's not an optimal time to be selling and you want to ride it out a little bit longer and let your equity, come back so that you can get out of the purchase without, losing lots of money. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think, well, okay, so there's financial risk, but then there's also just responsibilities. So with renting, you have very little in this way of responsibilities. You can call your landlord for any little thing that goes wrong. And maybe as a graduate student, you really value that. Or on the other side of things, maybe you like to be responsible for your home and you don't mind doing the minor repairs or finding the contractor or whatever. It's more of, I think, a personality thing that you just have to know about yourself, whether you're up for that kind of responsibility. And maybe during graduate school, you see yourself as, I'm pressed for time and I don't want to have that responsibility. That could be a reasonable approach to take. Okay, I'll stop there because I think Sam and I could probably go back and forth on this for like quite a while.